The rain hammered against the windows of the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Belgrade as Elena Petrova adjusted the scope on her rifle. She had been tracking her target for 3 weeks, and tonight would finally bring closure to a mission that had consumed her life for the past 6 months. The year was 2019, and Elena had earned a reputation that made even the most hardened criminals whisper her name in fear. Elena was not her real name, of course. That identity had died along with her family 5 years ago in a bombing that was officially labeled as a terrorist attack. But Elena knew better. She had spent years uncovering the truth, following a trail of corruption that led straight to the highest levels of government and organized crime. The woman the underworld now called Night Widow had once been Dr. Anastasia Volkov, a respected trauma surgeon who had dedicated her life to saving others. The transformation began on a cold February evening when Anastasia returned home from a particularly difficult surgery to find her apartment building reduced to rubble. Her husband, Victor, an investigative journalist, and their 8-year-old daughter, Mila, were supposed to be safely asleep in their beds. Instead, Anastasia found herself digging through concrete and twisted metal with her bare hands, desperately searching for any sign of life. The rescue workers eventually pulled her away, but not before she had seen enough to know that this was no accident. Victor had been investigating a human trafficking ring with connections to several prominent politicians. His final article, published posthumously, exposed a network that stretched across Eastern Europe, involving corrupt officials, military personnel, and crime syndicates. The bombing was meant to silence him forever, but they had not counted on his wife's determination to seek justice. The official investigation was a sham. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence vanished, and the case was quickly closed with a convenient scapegoat, a mentally unstable man with no real connections to any terrorist organization. Anastasia knew that pursuing justice through legal channels would only result in her own death. She had to become someone else entirely. The first year after the tragedy was spent in careful preparation. Anastasia legally changed her identity to Elena Petrov, using forged documents purchased from the same criminal networks she planned to destroy. She sold everything she owned and used the money to disappear completely. Her medical knowledge proved invaluable as she learned to treat her own wounds and understand human anatomy in ways that would help her eliminate targets efficiently. Elena sought training from sources that existed in the shadows of legitimate society. A former Spetsnaz operator, discharged for refusing to participate in war crimes, taught her close-quarters combat and weapons handling. An ex-CIA operative, bitter about being abandoned by his agency, showed her surveillance techniques and how to blend into any environment. A computer hacker, whose sister had been trafficked and never found, gave her the digital skills needed to track her enemies through their electronic footprints. But perhaps her most valuable teacher was an elderly woman named Katya, who ran a small flower shop in Prague. Katya had been a sniper during World War II, credited with over 200 confirmed kills of Nazi officers. She had spent her later years in quiet anonymity, but something in Elena's story reminded her of her own quest for justice decades earlier. Under Katya's guidance, Elena learned patience, precision, and the mental discipline required to take a life without losing her own humanity. The training was grueling, both physically and emotionally. Elena pushed her body to its limits, learning to function on minimal sleep, to ignore pain, and to move through urban and rural environments without leaving a trace. She studied languages, practiced different accents, and learned to adopt various personas that would allow her to get close to her targets. Most importantly, she learned to suppress the grief and rage that threatened to consume her, channeling those emotions into cold, calculated determination. Elena's first target was a mid-level arms dealer named Dmitry Kozlov, who had supplied the explosives used in the bombing. She spent 2 months learning his routines, his habits, and his weaknesses. Dmitry was careful, always surrounded by bodyguards, and rarely venturing outside his heavily fortified compound. But he had one weakness: his addiction to high-stakes poker games held in exclusive underground clubs. On a snowy March evening, Ayla infiltrated one of these games disguised as the mistress of a wealthy businessman. She had practiced for weeks to perfect the role, studying the mannerisms and speech patterns of women who moved in these circles. Her medical background helped her maintain perfect composure even as she sat across from the man responsible for her family's death. The game lasted until dawn, with Elena carefully managing her cards to ensure she would be among the final players. When only she and Dmitri remained, she made her move. As he reached for his winning hand, Elena's fingers found the pressure point on his neck that would cause immediate unconsciousness. To the security cameras, it appeared that Dmitri had simply collapsed from exhaustion and alcohol. Elena calmly called for medical assistance, using her doctor credentials to take charge of the situation. In the ambulance, with Dmitri unconscious and the paramedics focused on driving through heavy traffic, Elena administered a drug that would cause a massive heart attack within hours. The substance was undetectable in routine toxicology tests and would be attributed to Dmitri's known heart condition and high-stress lifestyle. By the time his body was discovered in his compound the next morning, Elena was already planning her next move. The death sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. Dmitri had been known for his paranoia and security measures, yet someone had managed to eliminate him without leaving any evidence. The authorities ruled it a natural death, but his associates knew better. Someone was hunting them, and they had no idea who or why. Elena's second target proved more challenging. Colonel Alexei Markov was a decorated military officer who used his position to facilitate the trafficking operations. He was intelligent, well-connected, and had survived numerous attempts on his life by rival criminal organizations. Markov never stayed in the same location for more than 2 nights, traveled with a full security detail, and had informants throughout law enforcement. For this mission, Elena decided to use Markov's own paranoia against him. She began leaving subtle signs of surveillance around his various safe houses: a cigarette butt that hadn't been there before, a car parked in the same spot for multiple days, small scratches on locks that suggested someone had been picking them. She never actually threatened him directly, but the psychological pressure mounted as Markov became convinced that he was being stalked. After 6 weeks of this psychological warfare, convinced that his enemies had infiltrated his security team, he dismissed his bodyguards and retreated to what he believed was his most secure location, a remote cabin in the mountains that only he knew about. Elena had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. She had discovered the cabin weeks earlier through careful analysis of Markov's financial records and travel patterns. While he thought he was hiding, Elena was already in position, having spent 3 days preparing the surrounding area. She had studied the cabin's layout, identified all possible escape routes, and positioned various contingencies throughout the property. When Markov arrived, he felt safe for the first time in months. The cabin was equipped with sophisticated alarm systems and had clear sight lines in all directions. What he didn't know was that Elena had been living in a camouflaged position less than 50 meters away, surviving on minimal supplies and waiting for him to make his move. On his second night at the cabin, as Markov sat in front of the fireplace reviewing encrypted communications with his criminal partners, Elena made her approach. She had waited for the perfect moment, a heavy snowstorm that would muffle any sounds and eliminate visibility beyond a few meters. Moving like a shadow, she disabled the external alarm systems using techniques learned from her hacker friend. The cabin's interior was warm and brightly lit, making it impossible for Markov to see outside. Elena positioned herself at a window that gave her a clear shot while remaining invisible to anyone inside. Through her scope, she could see Markov reading documents that likely contained details about future trafficking operations. She took a deep breath, steadied her aim, and gently squeezed the trigger. The shot was perfect, instantly fatal, and appeared to come from an impossible angle. When Markov's body was discovered days later, investigators found no footprints in the snow, no evidence of forced entry, and no witnesses. The murder weapon was never recovered, and the trajectory of the bullet suggested the shooter had fired from a position that would have required superhuman accuracy in impossible weather conditions. 2 deaths in 3 months sent the criminal network into chaos. Leaders began turning on each other, convinced that rival organizations were making a move against them. Security was increased, meetings were canceled, and several key figures went into hiding. But Elena was just getting started. Her third target was the most dangerous yet: Yevgeny Volkov, a crime boss who controlled much of the trafficking network's operations. Yevgeny was not just ruthless in his business dealings. He was also highly intelligent and had spent years studying the tactics of various intelligence agencies. He understood that someone was systematically eliminating his associates. and he was determined to identify and kill his hunter before becoming the next victim. Yevgeny's response to the threat was methodical and brutal. He increased security around all his operations, brought in specialists from international criminal organizations, and began systematically eliminating anyone who might have information about his network. Dozens of low-level criminals, informants, and even innocent civilians who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time were murdered as Yevgeny tried to flush out his enemy. Elena watched this violence with growing anger, knowing that her quest for justice was causing the deaths of people who had nothing to do with her family's murder. But she also recognized that Yevgeny's paranoid response was creating opportunities. His brutal tactics were alienating potential allies and creating enemies within his own organization. Several of his lieutenants began reaching out to rival crime families, offering information in exchange for protection. One of these defectors was a woman named Irina, who had been forced into Yevgeny's organization after her brother was murdered for refusing to participate in trafficking operations. Irina had been looking for a way out for years, and the recent chaos provided the opportunity she needed. Through careful intermediaries, she made contact with Elena, offering crucial information about Yevgeny's habits and security arrangements. The meeting took place in an abandoned church on the outskirts of Moscow. Elena arrived hours early, positioning herself to observe the entire area and ensure that Irina wasn't leading her into a trap. When the woman finally appeared, she was clearly terrified but determined to see Yevgeny's reign of terror end. Irina revealed that Yevgeny would be attending a private auction the following week, where trafficked women were sold to wealthy clients from around the world. The location was a converted warehouse that had been transformed into a luxurious venue for this horrific trade. Security would be heavy, but Yevgeny's arrogance would be his weakness. He insisted on personally inspecting the merchandise before each auction, spending time alone with the victims to assess their value. Elena spent the week preparing for what would be her most complex operation yet. The warehouse was heavily guarded, equipped with sophisticated surveillance systems, and filled with dangerous criminals. But Elena had advantages that her enemies couldn't anticipate. Her medical background allowed her to understand the sedatives being used on the victims. Her technical training helped her identify vulnerabilities in the security systems, and her psychological preparation enabled her to remain focused despite the horror of what she would witness. The night of the auction, Elena arrived disguised as a member of the catering staff. She had spent days studying the staff's routines and had eliminated one of the regular workers, taking her place without anyone noticing the substitution. Moving through the warehouse with practiced confidence, Elena positioned surveillance devices that would allow her to track Yevgeny's movements while remaining undetected. As the evening progressed, Elena witnessed scenes that tested every aspect of her emotional control. The auction was attended by dozens of wealthy men who bid on human beings as if they were objects. Yevgeny played the role of gracious host, but Elena could see the cold calculation behind his smile as he orchestrated this trade in human misery. When Yevgeny finally made his way to the holding area to inspect the victims before the final round of bidding, Elena was ready. She had disabled several security cameras and created a blind spot that would allow her to approach undetected. The victims were being held in small cells, drugged and terrified, while Yevgeny moved from one to another like a rancher evaluating livestock. Elena waited until Yevgeny was in the most isolated section of the holding area, far from the guards and other attendees. She approached silently, using techniques learned from Katya to move without making any sound. When she was close enough, Elena pressed her knife to Yevgeny's throat and whispered a single phrase that would haunt him in his final moments. "This is for the Volkov family."
Yevgeny's death marked a turning point in Elena's mission.
As his body was discovered in the warehouse holding area, with the victims mysteriously freed and several key pieces of evidence about the trafficking network scattered around the scene, law enforcement agencies across Europe finally began to take notice of the systematic elimination of criminal figures. But instead of viewing these deaths as acts of justice, they saw them as the work of a dangerous vigilante who needed to be stopped. The investigation into what media outlets began calling the Phantom Killer was led by Detective Inspector Sarah Chen, a brilliant investigator with Interpol who specialized in tracking international criminals. Chen had been following the trafficking network for years, frustrated by the corruption and political interference that prevented successful prosecutions. When bodies started appearing with increasing frequency, she recognized patterns that suggested a single, highly skilled operative was responsible. Chen's analysis of the crime scenes revealed disturbing details about their perpetrator. The killer possessed extensive medical knowledge, advanced military training, sophisticated technical skills, and an intimate understanding of the criminal network's operations. Most troubling was the psychological profile that emerged. Someone driven by personal revenge but operating with cold, calculated precision that suggested professional training at the highest levels. While law enforcement struggled to identify their target, Elena was dealing with the psychological aftermath of Yevgeny's death. The moment she had killed him, whispered his family's name, and watched the life leave his eyes. Something fundamental had changed within her. The rage that had sustained her for years was suddenly gone, replaced by an emptiness that threatened to consume her entirely. For the first time since beginning her mission, Elena found herself questioning whether revenge would truly bring her the peace she sought. Yevgeny's death had felt different from the others, more personal, more brutal, and ultimately less satisfying than she had anticipated. She had expected to feel closure, but instead experienced only a hollow sense that no amount of killing would bring her family back. Elena retreated to a safe house in the mountains of Romania, a cabin she had prepared months earlier as an emergency refuge. For 2 weeks, she isolated herself completely, struggling with depression and doubt while monitoring news reports about the investigation into her activities. The media coverage was sensationalized and largely inaccurate, but it revealed that her enemies were mobilizing resources on an unprecedented scale to find and eliminate her. During this period of isolation, Elena made a discovery that changed everything. While reviewing Victor's research notes, which she had memorized and hidden in various locations, she found references to a person identified only as the General. Victor had believed this individual was the ultimate authority behind the trafficking network, someone with the power to coordinate operations across multiple countries and protect the network from law enforcement interference. The references to the General were fragmentary and cryptic, but they painted a picture of someone with extensive military experience, high-level government connections, and access to intelligence resources that allowed the network to operate with virtual impunity. Victor had been close to identifying this person when he was killed, and Elena realized that eliminating lower-level operatives would never truly dismantle the organization. Elena's research into the General led her down a rabbit hole of connections that stretched back decades. Using her technical skills and contacts in the hacker community, she began tracing financial transactions, communication patterns, and operational logistics that pointed to a central coordination point. The trail was deliberately obscured, but Elena's medical training had taught her to recognize patterns that others might miss. After months of painstaking investigation, Elena identified 3 possible candidates for the General. Each was a retired military officer with the right background, connections, and resources to coordinate the trafficking network. But determining which of the 3 was actually responsible would require getting close enough to observe their activities personally. A dangerous proposition given the increased security measures throughout the criminal underworld. The first candidate was General Marcus Wolf, a former NATO commander who had retired under mysterious circumstances involving allegations of arms dealing. Wolf maintained residences in Switzerland and Montenegro, traveling frequently between legitimate business meetings and private gatherings that could provide cover for criminal coordination. His public persona was that of a successful military contractor. But Elena's investigation revealed financial patterns that suggested involvement in illegal activities. Elena spent 6 weeks conducting surveillance on Wolf, learning his routines and identifying potential vulnerabilities in his security arrangements. She discovered that despite his military background, Wolf had become complacent in retirement, relying more on his reputation than actual security measures to protect himself. His guards were professionals but not exceptional, and his travel patterns were predictable enough to create opportunities for close observation. The breakthrough came when Elena infiltrated a private military contractor conference in Vienna, where Wolf was scheduled to speak. Disguised as a journalist covering military affairs, Elena was able to get within a few meters of Wolf during his presentation and the networking session that followed. Her medical training allowed her to observe subtle behavioral cues that revealed important information about his psychological state and potential connections to criminal activities. During the conference, Elena overheard a conversation between Wolf and another attendee that confirmed her suspicions. Wolf mentioned delivery schedules and quality control issues in terms that clearly referred to human trafficking operations rather than legitimate military contracting. More importantly, he referenced someone else as having ultimate authority over these operations, indicating that while Wolf was certainly involved in the network, he was not the general. Elena's investigation of the second candidate, General Dmitry Kozlov, required different tactics. Kozlov was paranoid to the point of obsession, surrounded by multiple layers of security and rarely appearing in public. His background included command positions in special operations units and intelligence services, making him far more dangerous than Wolf. Kozlov lived in a fortified compound outside St. Petersburg, surrounded by former Special Forces personnel who served as both security guards and enforcers for his various criminal enterprises. Getting close to Kozlov required Elena to adopt her most dangerous persona yet. She created an identity as a former military intelligence officer seeking employment in Kozlov's organization. The background story was risky because it invited scrutiny from people with the skills to verify such claims, but it was the only way to get inside Kozlov's inner circle. The vetting process for Kozlov's organization was brutal and comprehensive. Elena was subjected to polygraph tests, background investigations, and physical challenges designed to test her claimed military experience. Her medical knowledge proved invaluable in fooling the polygraph, while her actual training allowed her to pass physical tests that would have exposed most imposters. After 3 weeks of testing, Elena was accepted into Kozlov's security team with probationary status. This gave her access to the compound and opportunities to observe Kozlov's activities, but it also put her under constant surveillance by suspicious colleagues who were looking for any sign that she might be an infiltrator. Elena's time inside Kozlov's organization revealed the true scope of the trafficking network's operations. The compound served as a coordination center for activities across Europe and Asia, with regular communications from criminal associates in dozens of countries. Elena documented everything she could, building a comprehensive picture of the network's structure and operations while maintaining her cover as a loyal security operative. However, after 2 months of observation, Elena concluded that Kozlov was not the general either. While he was clearly a senior figure in the network, he too answered to higher authority. Elena observed him taking orders during encrypted video calls with someone whose voice and image were carefully disguised. The person on the other end of these communications gave detailed instructions about operational changes, resource allocation, and strategic decisions that affected the entire network. Elena's investigation of the third candidate, General Catherine Morrison, proved to be the most complex and dangerous of all. Morrison was a former U.S. Army intelligence officer who had transitioned to a successful career in international consulting after leaving the military. Her public image was that of a respected expert in security affairs, frequently quoted in media outlets, and serving on various advisory boards for legitimate organizations. Unlike the other candidates, Morrison appeared to have no obvious criminal connections. Her financial records were clean, her associates were reputable, and her activities seemed focused entirely on legitimate business and consulting work. But Elena's investigation revealed subtle patterns that suggested Morrison might be using her legitimate activities as cover for criminal coordination. The key insight came when Elena analyzed the travel patterns of known trafficking network operatives in relation to Morrison's consulting engagements. There was a remarkable correlation between Morrison's business trips and subsequent changes in trafficking operations in those regions. When Morrison visited cities for consulting work, criminal activities in those areas would often be reorganized, rerouted, or modified within days of her departure. Elena realized that Morrison was using her legitimate consulting business to coordinate criminal operations while maintaining perfect cover. Her expertise in security affairs gave her access to information about law enforcement activities. Her international travel provided opportunities for face-to-face meetings with criminal associates, and her reputation protected her from suspicion by authorities. Confirming Morrison's identity as the general required Elena to take enormous risks. Morrison's security arrangements were sophisticated and largely invisible, relying on intelligence tradecraft rather than obvious protection measures. Elena had to use every skill she had learned over the past few years to conduct surveillance without being detected by someone with Morrison's training and resources. The confirmation came during a conference in Prague where Morrison was delivering a keynote address on international security cooperation. Elena had positioned herself as a technical assistant for the conference organizers, giving her access to areas that would normally be restricted to attendees. Using surveillance equipment acquired from her hacker contacts, Elena was able to monitor Morrison's private communications during breaks in the conference schedule. During one of these intercepted conversations, Morrison used a specific phrase that Elena recognized from Victor's notes. "Ask your general who I am." Victor had heard this phrase during his investigation and believed it was a coded reference used by the network's ultimate leader. Hearing Morrison use these exact words confirmed Elena's identification of her target. But as Elena prepared to eliminate Morrison, she made a disturbing discovery. Morrison was not just the general. She was also aware of Elena's activities and had been tracking her investigation. Elena realized this when she found sophisticated surveillance devices in her hotel room and noticed that some of her electronic communications had been intercepted and analyzed. The hunter had become the hunted, and Elena found herself in a deadly game of cat and mouse with an opponent who possessed all of her skills, plus access to government and military resources that Elena couldn't match. Morrison knew Elena's true identity, understood her motivations, and was preparing to use that knowledge to eliminate the threat Elena represented to her criminal empire. Elena's first indication of how much danger she was in came when she returned to her safe house in Romania to find it had been completely compromised. The cabin showed signs of professional search techniques, with every possible hiding place systematically examined. Worse, Elena found evidence that Morrison's people had been there recently. Personal items were moved just slightly from their original positions, a technique used to let targets know they were under surveillance. Realizing that all of her prepared safe houses were likely compromised, Elena was forced to go completely off the grid. She abandoned all of her established identities, electronic devices, and pre-positioned resources, relying instead on basic survival skills and cash reserves she had hidden in locations that existed only in her memory. For 3 weeks, Elena lived like a fugitive, sleeping in abandoned buildings, avoiding all electronic communications, and moving constantly to stay ahead of Morrison's search teams. During this period, she began to understand the true scope of Morrison's power and influence. The search for Elena involved not just criminal operatives but also legitimate law enforcement agencies that had been fed false information about Elena's activities. Elena realized that Morrison had managed to convince various police and intelligence agencies that Elena was a terrorist threat rather than someone seeking justice for her family's murder. This meant that Elena was being hunted by people who genuinely believed they were protecting public safety, making it impossible for her to seek help from any official sources. The psychological pressure of being constantly hunted while cut off from all support systems began to take its toll on Elena. She found herself making small mistakes, staying in one location too long, using the same route twice, failing to properly check for surveillance. Each error brought Morrison's teams closer to finding her, and Elena knew that it was only a matter of time before she was caught or killed. During this period of desperate flight, Elena made a decision that would determine the final outcome of her mission. Instead of continuing to run, she would turn the tables on Morrison by using the one advantage she still possessed. Morrison didn't know that Elena had identified her as the General. Morrison believed Elena was still hunting random criminal operatives, unaware that her true target had been discovered. Elena decided to use Morrison's own tactics against her, by staging her own death and then using the confusion to get close enough to Morrison to end the game permanently. The plan was incredibly risky, requiring Elena to fake her death convincingly enough to fool Morrison's intelligence resources, while positioning herself for a final strike against her ultimate target. Elena's plan to fake her death required meticulous preparation under impossible circumstances. With Morrison's teams closing in and no safe haven available, Elena had to create a convincing death scene while establishing a new identity that could get her close to Morrison. The key was using her medical knowledge to simulate death in a way that would satisfy forensic examination, while allowing her to survive the process. The opportunity came when Elena learned that Morrison would be attending a high-level security conference in Geneva within 2 weeks. The conference would bring together military officials, intelligence personnel, and private security contractors from around the world. exactly the kind of gathering where Morrison could coordinate network operations while maintaining her legitimate cover. Elena realized this might be her only chance to get close to Morrison in a controlled environment. Elena began by acquiring the materials she would need for her deception. Using contacts from her underground network, she obtained powerful sedatives that could simulate death when administered in precise doses, synthetic blood for creating realistic wound effects, and explosive charges that could destroy evidence while creating the appearance of a suicide bombing. The plan was to stage her apparent death in a way that would eliminate any possibility of Morrison's people examining the scene too closely. The location Elena chose for her fake death was a small hotel in the mountains outside Geneva, close enough to the conference venue to be believable but isolated enough to control the investigation. Elena checked in using one of her compromised identities, knowing that Morrison's people would track her to this location within hours. She then spent 2 days preparing the hotel room with hidden charges, escape routes, and evidence that would support the narrative of her apparent death. Elena's medical training was crucial in calculating the exact dosage of sedatives needed to slow her vital signs to nearly undetectable levels without causing permanent damage. She had practiced this technique on herself several times, using her own body to test the effects and timing. The margin for error was extremely narrow. Too little sedative and the deception would be discovered. Too much and the fake death would become real. On the morning of her planned death, Elena received confirmation that Morrison's surveillance team had located her hotel. She could see them positioning themselves around the building, preparing to move in for capture. Elena knew she had perhaps 30 minutes before they would breach her room, giving her just enough time to execute her plan. Elena first administered the sedative through an IV line she had prepared, timing the dose so that the effects would begin just as Morrison's team reached her floor. She then activated small explosive charges hidden throughout the room, creating enough damage to suggest a suicide bombing while leaving her body apparently intact but severely injured. The explosions also destroyed most of the evidence of her preparations, leaving investigators with only the narrative Elena wanted them to find. When Morrison's team breached the room, they found what appeared to be Elena's body amid the wreckage of a suicide bombing. The explosions had damaged the room's structure enough to make detailed forensic examination impossible, and Elena's apparent injuries were consistent with someone who had been caught in the blast. Her vital signs were so weak as to be virtually undetectable, and the massive trauma from the explosion provided a plausible explanation for her condition. Elena's body was taken to a local morgue, where her medical knowledge proved crucial once again. She had researched the facility's procedures and knew that bodies from violent deaths were often stored for several days before autopsy, giving her time to recover from the sedatives and execute the next phase of her plan. She had also identified a sympathetic morgue attendant through her network contacts, someone who could be bribed to look the other way during her escape. After 18 hours in the morgue, Elena regained enough consciousness to implement her escape plan. The attendant she had contacted helped her leave the facility in exchange for a substantial payment and assurances that his cooperation would never be discovered. Elena then activated a pre-positioned identity she had prepared months earlier, documentation for a Serbian forensic specialist named Dr. Milica Jovanovic, who had been hired as a consultant for the security conference. The identity was perfect for Elena's needs because it provided legitimate access to the conference while explaining her medical knowledge and attention to detail. As Dr. Jovanovic, Elena was supposed to brief conference attendees on forensic evidence techniques used in terrorist investigations, a role that would allow her to interact directly with Morrison without raising suspicion. Elena's apparent death had the desired effect on Morrison's organization. Believing that their primary threat had been eliminated, they relaxed security measures and returned to normal operations. Morrison herself seemed satisfied that the vigilante who had been hunting her network was no longer a concern. Intelligence reports confirming Elena's death were distributed to various law enforcement agencies, officially closing the investigation into the Phantom Killer. However, Detective Inspector Sarah Chen was not convinced by the reports of Elena's death. Chen had been studying the case for months and had developed a psychological profile that suggested their target was too sophisticated to be eliminated so easily. The circumstances of the supposed suicide bombing seemed inconsistent with the calculated, precise methods the killer had used in previous operations. Chen's doubts led her to conduct her own investigation into the Geneva incident. She discovered several anomalies that suggested the death scene had been staged. including forensic evidence that didn't quite match the official narrative, and witness accounts that contained subtle inconsistencies. Chen began to suspect that the Phantom Killer was still alive and planning something even more ambitious. Meanwhile, Elena was implementing the most dangerous phase of her mission. As Dr. Jovanovich, she attended the Geneva Security Conference, moving freely among high-level officials and private security personnel while maintaining her cover as a legitimate forensic consultant. The irony was not lost on Elena that she was discussing investigative techniques with the same people who had been hunting her for months. Elena's first direct encounter with Morrison came during a panel discussion on international terrorism. Morrison was one of the featured speakers, presenting her analysis of recent terrorist incidents and their implications for security policy. Elena found herself sitting just a few meters away from the woman responsible for her family's death, listening to Morrison discuss security threats that included Elena's own activities. The challenge for Elena was controlling her emotional response to being so close to Morrison. Years of training and preparation had taught her to suppress rage and maintain perfect composure, but hearing Morrison speak about terrorist threats while knowing her true identity as a criminal mastermind tested Elena's self-control to its limits. She forced herself to take detailed notes and ask relevant questions, maintaining her cover as a professional consultant while planning Morrison's destruction. Elena's opportunity came when she learned that Morrison would be hosting a private reception for selected conference attendees at her hotel suite. The gathering was positioned as a networking event for security professionals, but Elena recognized it as a perfect cover for Morrison to meet privately with criminal associates who were attending the conference under legitimate identities. Getting invited to Morrison's reception required Elena to demonstrate expertise that would make her valuable to someone in Morrison's position. During conference sessions, Elena shared insights about forensic techniques that could be used to investigate trafficking operations, presenting herself as someone who could help security professionals stay ahead of law enforcement efforts. The irony of using her knowledge to help criminals evade justice was bitter, but it achieved the desired result. Morrison personally invited Dr. Jovanovic to the reception, expressing particular interest in her expertise regarding forensic countermeasures. Elena realized that Morrison was always looking for ways to improve her criminal operations, and her apparent expertise in investigative techniques made her a valuable potential asset. The invitation gave Elena exactly the access she needed to eliminate Morrison while maintaining perfect cover. The reception was held in Morrison's luxury suite, attended by approximately 20 people, who represented a mix of legitimate security professionals and criminal operatives. Elena recognized several attendees from her previous investigations, including associates of the men she had killed earlier in her mission. The gathering represented a significant portion of the trafficking network's leadership, concentrated in a single location. Elena arrived at the reception armed with weapons that were virtually undetectable: a ceramic knife that wouldn't trigger metal detectors, poison that could be administered through skin contact, and small explosive devices disguised as electronic equipment. Her medical knowledge allowed her to prepare substances that would cause delayed reactions, giving her time to escape before their effects became apparent. However, as Elena observed the reception, she realized that eliminating Morrison alone would not be sufficient to destroy the network. The other attendees represented crucial elements of the criminal organization, and their survival would allow the trafficking operations to continue under new leadership. Elena made a fateful decision to eliminate as many network leaders as possible, even though doing so would make her escape significantly more difficult. Elena's first target at the reception was Viktor Petrov, a money launderer who had been present at the original planning meetings for the bombing that killed her family. She approached him during cocktail conversation, using her forensic expertise to discuss money laundering detection techniques while simultaneously administering contact poison through a handshake. The poison would cause a heart attack within an hour, giving Elena time to eliminate other targets before anyone realized what was happening. Her second target was Colonel Andreas Mueller, a corrupt military officer who facilitated arms shipments for the trafficking network. Elena engaged him in conversation about military security protocols, while positioning herself to administer another dose of contact poison. Mueller was discussing the challenges of maintaining operational security when Elena touched his hand while reaching for a drink, transferring enough toxin to ensure his death within the hour. Elena's medical knowledge proved invaluable in timing these eliminations. She had calculated the exact onset times for various poisons, allowing her to eliminate multiple targets while making their deaths appear coincidental rather than coordinated. To outside observers, Elena was simply a charming forensic consultant networking with security professionals, while in reality, she was systematically destroying the trafficking network's leadership. The most challenging elimination was Morrison herself. As the host of the reception, Morrison was constantly surrounded by other attendees and rarely in a position where Elena could approach without witnesses. Elena had to wait for the perfect moment while maintaining her cover as an interested professional consultant seeking to learn from Morrison's expertise. The opportunity came when Morrison offered to show Elena some classified security documents that related to her forensic work. Morrison led Elena to a private study adjoining the main reception area, closing the door behind them to ensure their conversation couldn't be overheard. Elena realized that Morrison was likely planning to recruit her for criminal activities, unaware that she was about to face the person who had spent years hunting her organization. In the privacy of the study, Elena revealed her true identity for the first time since beginning her mission. She told Morrison about Victor's investigation, the bombing that killed her family, and the systematic elimination of network operatives that had brought them to this moment. Morrison's reaction confirmed everything Elena had suspected. She showed no surprise at these revelations, indicating that she had been aware of the network's criminal activities from the beginning. Morrison's response was to reach for a concealed weapon while simultaneously activating a silent alarm that would bring security personnel to the study. But Elena had anticipated this reaction and was already moving to neutralize the threat. Her years of training culminated in a brief but deadly confrontation that ended with Morrison's death and Elena's escape from the hotel suite. However, Elena's escape was complicated by the fact that the other reception attendees were beginning to show symptoms of poisoning. As she left the study, she could see Viktor Petrov clutching his chest in apparent cardiac distress, while Colonel Mueller was experiencing difficulty breathing. The simultaneous medical emergencies would soon reveal that the reception had been the site of a coordinated assassination attempt. Elena had minutes to escape before the hotel would be locked down and searched by security personnel. She made her way to an emergency stairwell she had identified during her reconnaissance, avoiding elevators and main corridors where she might encounter security cameras or witnesses. Her escape route led to a service area where she had hidden civilian clothes that would allow her to blend in with hotel staff during the evacuation that would inevitably follow. As Elena changed clothes and prepared to leave the building, she could hear alarms beginning to sound throughout the hotel. Emergency medical personnel were being summoned to deal with multiple cardiac emergencies, while hotel security was implementing lockdown procedures to prevent potential threats from escaping. Elena's timing was perfect. She walked out of the hotel as emergency responders were rushing in, appearing to be a staff member evacuating during the crisis. The aftermath of the Geneva hotel incident sent shockwaves through both the criminal underworld and international law enforcement agencies. Within hours of the emergency response, authorities discovered that 7 prominent figures in the security and military consulting world had died simultaneously from what appeared to be coordinated poisoning. The victims included Morrison and several others whom Elena had eliminated during the reception, creating the largest single blow against the trafficking network in its entire existence. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen arrived in Geneva within 24 hours of the incident, officially representing Interpol's investigation into what media outlets were already calling the Geneva Massacre. Chen had been tracking the Phantom Killer case for months, and the sophisticated nature of the hotel operation confirmed her suspicions that their target was still alive and had achieved something unprecedented in criminal investigation history. Chen's analysis of the crime scene revealed the true scope of Elena's achievement. The 7 victims represented key figures in a trafficking network that had operated across multiple continents for over a decade, generating billions in illegal profits while destroying thousands of lives. Their simultaneous elimination had effectively decapitated the organization, leaving surviving members scrambling to maintain operations without central coordination. However, Chen also recognized that the hotel operation represented a dramatic escalation in the killer's methods. Previous eliminations had been surgical and precise, targeting specific individuals with minimal collateral damage. The Geneva incident demonstrated a willingness to take enormous risks and cause multiple casualties simultaneously, suggesting that the perpetrator had identified a crucial opportunity to strike at the network's core leadership. Elena's escape from Geneva marked the beginning of the most challenging phase of her mission. While she had successfully eliminated Morrison and severely damaged the trafficking network, she was now the most wanted person in Europe. Her fake death had been exposed when forensic analysis of the hotel incident revealed that Dr. Milica Jovanovic was a fabricated identity, leading investigators to conclude that the Phantom Killer had infiltrated the security conference using sophisticated counterintelligence techniques. The international manhunt that followed Elena's exposure was unlike anything seen in recent criminal investigation history. Interpol, Europol, and national security agencies from a dozen countries coordinated their efforts to track down someone who had demonstrated the ability to eliminate high-value targets while evading the most advanced surveillance systems available to law enforcement. Elena realized that her previous tactics of hiding in safe houses and maintaining false identities would no longer be effective against this level of scrutiny. Instead, she adopted a strategy of constant movement, never staying in any location for more than a few hours, while using her medical knowledge and technical skills to alter her appearance and behavior in ways that would defeat both human observation and electronic surveillance. For 6 months, Elena lived as a ghost, moving through the shadows of European society while conducting the final phase of her mission. Her years of careful investigation had revealed that the trafficking network, despite losing its central leadership, still possessed significant operational capability through regional commanders and local criminal organizations that had been integrated into the larger structure. Elena's target list included 12 remaining figures who possessed the knowledge and resources necessary to rebuild the trafficking network. These individuals were now aware that they were being hunted and had implemented security measures that made them extremely difficult to locate and eliminate. Each represented a unique challenge that would require Elena to adapt her methods and take risks that could easily result in her capture or death. The first of these targets was Sergei Volkov, a Russian oligarch who had provided financial backing for the trafficking operations while using his legitimate business empire as cover for money laundering activities. Volkov had retreated to his estate outside Moscow, surrounding himself with private security forces and maintaining communication with the outside world only through encrypted channels monitored by intelligence professionals. Elena's approach to eliminating Volkov required her to infiltrate the Russian oligarch's inner circle by posing as a specialist in offshore financial structures. This identity allowed her to gain access to Volkov's compound during a meeting about restructuring his business operations in response to international sanctions. Elena spent weeks preparing for this infiltration, studying Russian financial law and creating a background that would withstand scrutiny from Volkov's advisors. The elimination itself took place during a private dinner where Volkov was discussing plans to rebuild the trafficking network with new leadership structures. Elena used a delayed-action poison that she administered through a chess piece during a game that followed dinner. Volkov's death appeared to be from natural causes related to his existing heart condition, allowing Elena to leave the compound without suspicion falling on any of the evening's guests. Elena's second target, Maria Santos, required completely different tactics. Santos was a former intelligence operative who had used her government connections to facilitate the trafficking network's operations in South America. She was highly trained in counter-surveillance techniques and had established multiple layers of security that made conventional approaches impossible. Elena decided to use Santos's own paranoia against her by creating false evidence that suggested other trafficking network members were planning to eliminate her to prevent her cooperation with law enforcement. Elena planted this disinformation through channels that Santos would trust, causing her to emerge from hiding to confront what she believed were threats from former associates. The confrontation Elena had orchestrated took place in an abandoned warehouse in Buenos Aires, where Santos arrived believing she was meeting with another trafficking network leader to negotiate her safety. Instead, she found Elena waiting with comprehensive evidence of Santos's criminal activities and an ultimatum: commit suicide or face public exposure that would result in her torture and death at the hands of victims' families who had been tracking her location. Santos chose to take the poison Elena offered, rather than face the alternative, ending her life while providing Elena with detailed information about remaining network operations in exchange for assurances that her family would not be targeted. This information proved invaluable in locating and eliminating several other network figures who had been using Santos's intelligence connections to maintain their criminal activities. Elena's systematic elimination of the trafficking network's remaining leadership created a domino effect throughout the criminal underworld. As each figure died or disappeared, their associates became increasingly paranoid and began turning against each other in attempts to identify and eliminate what they saw as an internal threat. This paranoia accelerated the network's collapse, with many operations shutting down as criminals fled or sought protection from law enforcement. Detective Inspector Chen continued to track Elena's activities throughout this period, developing an increasingly sophisticated understanding of her target's methods and motivations. Chen realized that Elena was not simply a vigilante seeking random revenge, but someone with intimate knowledge of the trafficking network, who was systematically dismantling a specific criminal organization. Chen's investigation eventually led her to uncover Viktor Volkov's original research into the trafficking network, revealing the connection between the journalist's murder and the subsequent elimination campaign. This discovery allowed Chen to understand Elena's true identity and the personal motivations driving her mission, fundamentally changing the nature of the investigation. Instead of viewing Elena purely as a criminal to be captured, Chen began to see her as someone seeking justice for crimes that the legal system had failed to address. This shift in perspective led Chen to make a controversial decision. Rather than continuing to hunt Elena, she would attempt to establish contact and offer an alternative to the cycle of violence that was consuming both Elena and her enemies. Chen's attempt to contact Elena required her to use unofficial channels and risk her own career in law enforcement. She began leaving coded messages in locations where Elena's surveillance activities had been detected, offering to meet and discuss terms for ending the violence while ensuring that justice was served through legal means. Elena initially ignored these overtures, suspecting that they represented an attempt to lure her into a trap. However, as Chen continued to leave messages that demonstrated detailed knowledge of Viktor's research and genuine understanding of Elena's motivations, Elena began to consider the possibility that this law enforcement officer might be offering a legitimate alternative to her mission. The eventual meeting between Elena and Chen took place in a secure location that Elena had prepared with multiple escape routes and counter-surveillance measures. Chen arrived alone, as promised, carrying documentation that proved she had been investigating the trafficking network through official channels and had compiled evidence that could result in prosecutions of surviving network members. Chen's proposal was straightforward. Elena would provide her with intelligence about remaining trafficking network operations, while Chen would ensure that this information was used to bring criminal charges against surviving network members through legitimate legal processes. In exchange, Elena would disappear permanently, abandoning her vigilante activities while allowing justice to be served through proper channels. Elena was initially skeptical of Chen's ability to achieve meaningful prosecutions, given the corruption and political influence that had protected the trafficking network for years. However, Chen explained that Elena's elimination campaign had fundamentally changed the political landscape surrounding these cases, making it possible for law enforcement agencies to pursue prosecutions that would have been impossible before. The deaths of Morrison and other network leaders had eliminated the sources of corruption and intimidation that had previously protected the trafficking operations. Additionally, the dramatic nature of Elena's campaign had created international pressure for decisive law enforcement action, giving agencies like Interpol the political cover needed to pursue complex international prosecutions. After careful consideration, Elena agreed to Chen's proposal. She provided detailed intelligence about remaining network operations, including financial records, communication intercepts, and operational details that would be crucial for successful prosecutions. This information represented years of careful investigation and would give law enforcement agencies their best opportunity to completely dismantle the trafficking network. Elena's intelligence led to coordinated raids across 12 countries, resulting in the arrest of over 300 individuals involved in various aspects of the trafficking network. The operation, dubbed Night Widow, in recognition of Elena's role in making it possible, represented the largest international law enforcement action against human trafficking in history. The prosecutions that followed resulted in convictions and lengthy prison sentences for dozens of high-level criminal figures, effectively ending the trafficking network that had operated with virtual impunity for over a decade. More importantly, the rescued victims received the support and rehabilitation services they needed to rebuild their lives, fulfilling the ultimate goal that had driven Elena's mission from the beginning. Elena herself disappeared following the conclusion of Operation Night Widow, leaving behind only a brief message for Chen expressing hope that the legal victories they had achieved together would provide the justice that her own vigilante activities could never have delivered. Detective Inspector Chen never saw or heard from Elena again, though she sometimes wondered if the woman who had once been known as the Phantom Killer had found the peace that had eluded her for so many years. The legacy of Elena's campaign extended far beyond the destruction of a single trafficking network. Her methods and the intelligence she provided influenced law enforcement approaches to international organized crime, demonstrating how individual determination and specialized skills could achieve results that traditional investigations had failed to produce. Years later, when Chen was asked about the case during a conference on international law enforcement cooperation, she would often quote the phrase that had become associated with Elena's campaign: "Ask your general who I am." Chen would explain that sometimes justice required individuals to step outside conventional systems, but that the ultimate goal should always be to strengthen those systems rather than replace them permanently. Elena's story became a cautionary tale about the costs of seeking justice through violence, but also an inspiration for those working within legal systems to address the failures that had made such extreme measures seem necessary. The Night Widow case demonstrated that even the most sophisticated criminal networks could be defeated when individual courage was combined with institutional support for justice. The trafficking network that had once seemed untouchable was completely destroyed, its leaders dead or imprisoned, and its victims finally receiving the justice they deserved. Elena had achieved her goal of avenging her family's death, but more importantly, she had created a path for others to find justice without having to walk the dark road of vigilante violence that had nearly consumed her own humanity in the process.